Hello and welcome to another Magic the Gathering video. Today I'm going to be looking at a theme deck from the Invasion set. This is the Spectrum deck, and I'm going to be doing a bit of an analysis and a breakdown of this deck, how it hangs together. It's a 60 card deck, and decks around this time also came with a sort of free foil card, which was a land. So there's our foil. Okay, so as I've said, this was from the Invasion set. In that set there are a number of things there. There were multicoloured cards, and this deck has multicoloured cards, so that's cards which require more than one colour of mana to cost. Also there were cards with kicker abilities on them, which basically meant that when you played the card you could pay an extra kicker cost, and that would enhance the effect in some way. There are also split cards here which had effectively two spells on them, and what that did is when you went to play the spell you would pay the appropriate casting cost based on which spell you wanted to play, and you could only play one of the two. And then that would just go into play and resolve as normal. But like I said, you had to choose one or the other. Then there were a number of djinns, which were big creatures, and in this particular set they got smaller based on whether or not their particular colour was the most common or tied for most common among permanents. And in this particular deck there's a couple of those cards, and like I said, it's tied to the number of permanents that are present, and this deck sort of exploits that to its advantage, so it ensures that for those particular colours there aren't an awful lot of permanents present. And then there were also domain cards, and these were cards which exploited the fact that, or took advantage of you having a number of land types in play, and these were basic land types. So what I mean by that is you would get a better advantage if you had, say, a forest, a plains, an island and a swamp in play, than if you just had a forest and a plains. But they had to be individual basic land types. So again, if you had, say, two forests, a plains and an island in play, you'd get a better advantage by having a forest, a plains, an island and a swamp in play, even though it's effectively the same amount of potential mana. In one example you've only got 3 different land types, and in the other you've got 4 different basic land types. And remember, it's basic land types. So let's look at the deck. Because this deck is exploiting the presence of multiple basic land types, not surprisingly the mana base is fairly complex and awkward. The majority of this deck is built around forests. There's 14 forests, and the reason for that is, in order for this deck to work well, it needs to utilise the sort of mana ramping that green gives you, and was present in that set. In addition to those 14 forests, there's also two each of plains, islands, swamps and mountains, and these contribute to this effect that was nicknamed domain. So you've got basic lands. There's no non-basic lands in this, but there are a number of cards which help you get your lands into play. So we have 3 fertile grounds. This particular card can be used to enchant a land, and what this does is it doesn't so much get extra lands into play, but it generates extra mana whenever you tap a land for mana, when this is when this is used to enchant that land. So that's one way of generating other colours. And then this is actually an example of a card which does go away and search for land, puts it into play, or basic land. So in order to cast this, you have to sacrifice a land as well, and then you search out your library for 2 basic land cards. So you get 2 cards for sacrificing one, and you put them into play, and they come into play straight, they're not tapped. There's 3 of those. So not only does it enable you to increase the amount of available mana to you, but also it acts as like a filtration system, whereby if you had a lot of forests, you could sacrifice one of your forests and then convert it into 2 sort of non-forest basic lands. Of course, bearing in mind that with this particular deck you need to watch out for the inclusions of some Jinzi here in blue and red, whereby you want to avoid having too many blue or red permanents in play if you're going to play those, and we'll come on to those in a moment. There's also a number of cards which rely on you having a number of lands in play, a number of different lands in play. I'll just have a look at these. So this is where what was called domain. I'll do that one last actually, because that's a bit of a twist to that one. Tribal Flames. So this one deals X damage to a target creature or player, where X is the number of basic land types among lands you control. So the more land types you have in play, the more effective this spell becomes. And there's 2 of those. You've also got Ordered Migration, which is fairly high cost, 3 white and a blue, so quite awkward to cast. This puts a 1/1 blue bird creature token with flying into play for each basic land type among lands you control. So if you happen to have all 5 types out, this would put 5 1/1 blue bird creatures into play. And then going back to this one, Global Ruin, what this does is put you in a position of advantage over an opponent, and it forces each player to get rid of basic lands so that they're just left with 1 of each type of basic lands. So with this particular deck, if you're trying to get out 1 of each colour, and you're maybe sort of sacrificing your forests and using your harrow to do that, you could be in a good position where playing this, if you've got all sort of 5 basic land types in play, it's still going to give you 5 mana, whereas your opponent, particularly if they're playing like a mono colour deck, and you play this, they're going to be down to just 1 single mana card, one land, should I say. So those are all lands that sort of interact with this sort of domain concept, this idea of having 1 of each land type. Here's all the split cards here, so just so you can see these, there's a few of these. So you've got Wax and Wane. So the wax part is pump spell, and the wane part destroys target enchantments. Assault and battery. The assault part deals direct damage to a target creature or player for a cost of 1. And the battery part puts a 3/3 green elephant token into play for 3 and 1 green. And there's 2 of those. And then Spite and Malice. So Spite is basically a counter spell for non-creatures. and Malice is a destruction spell for non-black creatures, and when you destroy a creature using Malice, it can't be regenerated, and they're both fairly high costs. It's 4 mana in total. So those are all your split cards in the deck. Okay, moving on, we have an enchantment in here, and this enchantment obviously is going to be used in this case with creatures. It gives creatures that you control haste, and you can also sacrifice it to pump a target creature until end of turn. +2/+2, and that's 1 red and a green to cast that. That's the Fires of Yavimaya. And then we've got some blue spells down here, which give us card draw amongst other things. This one is Probe, so it allows us to draw 3 cards, and then we have to discard 2 from our hand. It also has a kicker ability on this, and if you pay the extra kicker cost, that will also force a target player to discard 2 cards from their hand. There's 2 of those. There's also Exclude in the deck. This is a counter spell against a creature again for 2 and a blue, but also you get to draw a card off of this, and there's 2 of those. So that is our spell base, or should I say our non-creature spell base, and then over here we have our creature base. So I've again laid this out in casting cost order. So we've got 1 green, so the bottom of our mana curve. Here we have Thornscape Apprentice. For cost of 1 we can tap a target creature, so we can tap down opponent's creatures or our own if we wanted to do that. And for red we can tap a target creature, we can we tap this and the target creature gains first strike until end of turn, and there's 3 of these and they're all 1/1s. And moving on to the 2 drops, we've got Nomadic Elf, and this acts as basically a mana filter, colour filter, so we can once this is in play and has overcome summoning sickness, we can pay 1 and a green, and we can add 1 mana of any colour to our mana pool. So that is sort of good for fixing mana early on when maybe we haven't got all the land out that we need to exploit things like domain and we're not in a position to cast any of our djinns. This allows us to get other stuff out while we're still trying to build our mana base, because this deck is very much about, early on in the game, you're basically constructing your mana base. So you need sort of cards that are going to help out early on in the game, just while you're waiting for that to come together. We've got Yavimaya Barbarian, so this is red and a green for 2/2, has protection from blue. There's 2 of those. Then there's a hole in the mana curve. There's no 3-drop creatures, so we move on to the 4 drops. This is an interesting card. This is a Voracious Cobra, so it's 2 red and a green, so it's a fairly awkward casting cost. It's a 2/2, so it doesn't sound particularly spectacular for what you're paying, but what's good about it is that in addition to it being a 2/2, it has first strike and this other ability which says whenever Voracious Cobra deals combat damage to a creature, destroy that creature. Now that does sound very much like Death Touch, but it's actually not if you look at the wording on a Death Touch card. So here's an example in another set. So this is Tide Hollow Strix. You can see the Death Touch here. Whenever this creature deals damage to a creature, destroy that creature. So it looks very similar, but this refers specifically to combat damage, whereas this is implying basically any damage that this creature might do. Now in its current format, it's going to only do creature damage anyway, but it means that if you've applied something to this card in some way which allows it to effectively ping a creature without actually, or doing damage without actually being in combat, this death touch would still apply. Whereas the ability on this card to destroy a creature only happens as part of combat damage. And that's quite an important distinction. Also what's interesting is that because it is not death touch, that's the big thing. So you'll notice, this hasn't been errated in the Oracle. It's basically the same as it's always been. So any changes to the rules that came in specifically to address some issues with death touch wouldn't apply to this because it isn't death touch. Quirion Trailblazer. So this is a good card because what this does is allow you to search your library for a basic land card when this comes into play. So it's got a enters the battlefield effect. That'll allow you to track down basic land and basically get your mana base sorted out. Now going back to this Voracious Cobra, actually another thing to think about is, of course, it's really important the interaction between First Strike and this destruction of a creature. So that makes it very powerful. And then we have down here our 5 drops. So in some ways all of these so far have fairly straightforward abilities that, if you're familiar with a lot of, even if you're just familiar with intro decks, you would have probably seen. For instance, this one here, Serpentine Carvu, you pay red, you gain haste until end of turn. And then Carvu Climber, when that comes into play, you get card draw. There's 2 of those. Now, in terms of unusual ability, it now gets interesting when we're talking about the higher cost creatures. So these are all our 6 drops. And this is when we start to see interactions between the cards and our mana base. So this Zanum Jin, 5 and a blue for a 5/6, has flying. So in order to do that, in order to have that sort of, when you relate the casting cost to the actual power and toughness, very respectable. There's got to be some downside. And the downside is that it gets -2/-2 as long as blue is the most common colour among all permanents or is tied for most common. And the way the deck's been constructed is to try and make sure that doesn't happen. So you'll notice there's only 2 blue, there's only 2 islands in here, and there's not many permanents in here in blue. In fact, apart from the mana base, these particular cards are the only permanents. They're the only cards that stick around. Then we got Halamjin. So again, 5 is 6 mana, so 5 and a red for a 6/5, as opposed to a 5/6. This has haste on it, and again with this gets -2/-2 as long as red is the most common card. So this is the one in red. Again, if you look at the cards on here, the only permanents present are land, and there's not many of those. So we're hoping that negative ability doesn't kick in. We've got Wayfaring Giant, so this one has a like a positive ability on it. 5 and a white for a 1/3, so very underpowered for the casting cost. But if we had one of each basic land type in play, then it would give it a pump of 5/5, so that would make it a 6/8 on that one. And then finally we have Sabretooth Nishoba, 4 green white for a 5/5, has trample, protection from blue, protection from red, but doesn't have any of these other abilities that are tied in with having a lot of or not many of a certain type of land in play. Okay, so that's our higher cost creatures. So when you're playing the deck, really this is the key thing. Is early on in the game, you're basically trying to build your mana using fertile grounds and harrow. Later, once you've got some stuff into play, you can then use Nomadic Elf and Quirion Trailblazer to basically also help with your mana. Like I said, one problem is there's a bit of a hole in the creature curve. So that's one thing you have to watch out for when you're playing this deck. But then by about turn 4 or 5, you're in a position to cast the more expensive creatures and exploit, hopefully having singles of each of these other coloured lands here in play. So that's really the idea, is once your mana base is built, you've got your cards there, you're in a position to start playing these, and these will really start to do lethal damage to an opponent. Ways in which the deck can be improved is really, one thing is to obviously pump up the number of fertile grounds and harrows, and you may need to take out some of the creatures which don't specifically interact with the mana base in order to do that, to keep it below 60 cards. And the other thing is to put in certain cards which exploit this mana base. So Tribal Flames, Global Ruins, Ordered Migration, those sort of cards. But as you can see, this deck really does rely on having a very solid multicoloured mana base. Okay, thanks for watching.